Hi, this lecture is about properties of water and specifically those properties of water that relate to living organisms. Understanding water chemistry is really critical to your understanding of living organisms. And just looking at the human body alone, not even considering living organisms that might even have a higher percentage of water, you can see the various amounts of water in our body. On average, the human body is about 60% water, and you can see that certain areas have more water than others. For example, the liver is 85% water. That's pretty high. So understanding water chemistry is a really important aspect of understanding human biology and the biology of all other living organisms. So you might have already watched a separate lecture on hydrogen bonds. If not, you might need to go back and watch that to really understand how water molecules connect to each other through hydrogen bonding. It's important to realize that in each water molecule, the two hydrogens are actually bonded to the oxygen by covalent bonds. Remember that covalent bonds involve sharing of electrons, but in the case of water, oxygen and hydrogen are not sharing those electrons equally. And the reason for that is oxygen is what we call very electronegative, meaning it has a very strong pull on those shared electrons relative to hydrogen. So those electrons are going to get pulled closer to oxygen, spend more time around oxygen. And since those electrons are negatively charged subatomic particles, they make oxygen a little bit negative. We call that a partial negative charge. And because those negative subatomic particles are orbiting a little bit further away from hydrogen, that makes hydrogen a little bit positive. So we consider hydrogen to have a partially positive charge. This is why we say water is a polar molecule, because there's this net partial charge difference within that molecule. Now, because of that, neighboring water molecules are weakly attracted to each other through what are called hydrogen bonds. So in this picture, the oxygen is depicted as the red ball and the two hydrogens are the two white balls. Those are held together with covalent bonds, sharing of electrons. It's a polar covalent bond because they're not sharing equally, but it's still covalent bonding holding the water together. It's the neighboring water molecules. Adjacent water molecules are attracted to each other because the partial positive charge of the hydrogen on one water is attracted to the partial negative charge of the oxygen on another water molecule. These hydrogen bonds are important to understand because they give water a lot of its unique properties that we're going to talk about in this lecture. So again, there is a separate lecture on hydrogen bonding if you need to know more about hydrogen bonds. So these are the properties of water we're going to go through in this lecture. And some of these we'll spend a little bit more time on, some we'll just quickly address. But these are the major properties that are relevant, again, in living organisms. There are lots of properties of water that are important in other aspects of chemistry, but we're really just focused on those for living organisms. And the first one we're going to talk about is the fact that water moderates temperature change. And if you know anything about aquatic environments, you probably already know that if you're an aquatic organism, you have a pretty constant temperature day to night and season to season. When animals moved onto land, they suddenly had this big challenge of having to keep their body temperature constant in an environment that really changes a lot day to day to night, season to season. So in this aquatic environment, the temperature is relatively constant, and that is because water moderates temperature change. The reason that water is able to moderate temperature change, is because those hydrogen bonds are able to absorb a lot of heat without causing the water to increase in temperature. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that, from a chemical standpoint, is that water has a high specific heat. So, just to define specific heat for you, specific heat, I'm going to write that definition out for you. The specific heat of something is the amount of energy required to increase the temperature, and I'm just going to abbreviate that as temp. Amount of energy required to increase the temperature of 1 gram of a substance by 1 degree Celsius. So that's a pretty specific definition. But if something has a high specific heat, it means that it requires a lot of energy to increase the temperature of that substance. You can see that in this picture, it requires a lot less energy input to increase the temperature of gold relative to water. Water takes a lot of energy to increase the temperature. And the reason for that, again, is the hydrogen bonds are able to absorb a lot of heat without causing that water to increase in temperature. So hydrogen bonds absorb heat with little change in the water temperature. Sorry, I ran out of room here. Again, I'm going to abbreviate it temp. Similarly, water can lose a lot of heat without decreasing in temperature. So water temperature is pretty constant. And again, that's because of these hydrogen bonds. What does this have to do with living organisms? What it has to do with living organisms, first of all, is that chemical reactions that take place in living organisms release a lot of heat. And you can see in this picture, photosynthesis is releasing heat, cellular respiration is releasing heat. There are a lot of reactions in the body that release what we often refer to as metabolic heat. And you don't necessarily need to know that phrase, but just the fact that chemical reactions release heat. Having water in a living organism, water is able to absorb a lot of that heat without increasing in temperature. Therefore, living organisms don't overheat for the most part, just due to the chemistry happening in their cells. Our cells don't burn up because we have water there to moderate that temperature change. So that's a really good feature of water. Also, as we already mentioned, if you are in an aquatic environment, you have a fairly constant temperature day to night and season to season. Relative to terrestrial life. So organisms on land have a lot more extremes of temperature that they have to deal with. You don't have to spend a lot of energy regulating your body temperature if you live in an aquatic environment. So a lake, a pond, a river, an ocean, you're not going to have to deal with those big changes in temperature. Related to this is the fact that water has a high heat of vaporization, meaning it takes a lot of energy input to cause water to change from a liquid to a gas. So when something vaporizes, it's changing from its liquid state to its gas state. And it takes a lot of energy input for water to change from liquid to gas. What that really means is that those hydrogen bonds, again, are absorbing that heat and allowing water to stay a liquid for longer compared to some other liquids that we could name. And what that allows us to do as living organisms, especially in mammals that have sweat glands, by the way, mammals are the only animals that have sweat glands, and not all mammals have a lot of them, but this is a feature unique to mammals, and that is that we can sweat, and that water can sit on the surface of the skin and allow that skin to cool because it's not immediately evaporating. It's staying on the surface and creating some cooling. And when it does evaporate, it helps cool even more. And if you're interested in the details, you can read those details there. But you don't need to know all those details of exactly what happens when the sweat evaporates. Just realize that this is related to water moderating temperature change. So a couple of examples there of how that property of water is relevant in living organisms. Okay, that was property number one. Property number two, cohesion and adhesion. A couple of important definitions here. The first one is cohesion. And cohesion basically means water molecules stick to each other. And you can see those two water molecules holding hands there through cohesion. And again, this is due to hydrogen bonding. So if you suck water up a straw, or you can put your finger on the end of a straw and pull water up that tube, all those water molecules are being pulled up a column, all attached to each other. So essentially, if you pull on one, you're pulling on all the ones in that chain that are attached by hydrogen bonding. And that's pretty cool. Adhesion is water molecules sticking to other molecules. And these are actually charged molecules. You don't need to know that level of detail in this class, but you can see the water clinging to the sides of what might be a tube in this case. So when you're sucking water up a straw, essentially the charge on the surface of that straw is causing the water molecules to cling to the sides. And what this is allowing is, number one, surface tension on the water because of those water molecules sticking to each other. But if you combine cohesion and adhesion together, you're going to get water being pulled through a system of tubes very easily. So these two combined together allow living organisms to transport water through a system of tubes or tubules. And in the case of this tree, you can imagine, think about where the water is for the tree. The water is down in the soil at the roots, and they need to transport that water sometimes over 100 feet up to those leaves at the top. That's a pretty long way to go. And the way a plant is able to do that is they open these little stomates, the stomata in their leaves, and just through evaporative pressure, they're able to pull that water up a tube very easily because of these properties of water. Cohesion, water molecules sticking to each other, and adhesion, the water molecules sticking to the sides of those tubules, being able to be easily pulled up that tube. What does that have to do with us? Well, we have a system of tubes we also move water through. Lots of tubules in our body, but the primary water transport system in our body is our circulatory system. So we're able to easily pull blood through this system of tubules, all of your capillaries and your veins and arteries. So think about this. You don't have a big pump down at your feet, and yet just the pumping action of your heart is able to move all of that blood all the way up your legs, back up to your heart again. And that's because of cohesion and adhesion. I skipped this slide because it wasn't as important as these other features, but cohesion is actually how water is able to form droplets. So water droplets are the result of cohesion and basically surface tension of that water. And you can see that shape there. This obviously helps organisms be able to take in water more easily, to drink water if you're an animal. So cohesion and adhesion are two very important properties of water. And that is our second property of water that we're studying. Okay, number 3, not as important, but pretty interesting. Water is less dense as a solid. This is pretty interesting because the definition of a solid is usually that it has a higher density than the liquid. So if you had a beaker of melted aluminum and you threw in a big piece of solid aluminum, it's going to sink right to the bottom. But if you threw in an ice cube, which is solid water, it's going to float. So saying that water is less dense as a solid is another way of saying ice floats. So what does this have to do with living organisms? Well, you can see this little shrimp, and he is under this ice cap. And now what that's going to do is that's going to serve as a thermal blanket. And now this water is not going to lose heat to the environment, and it's going to retain that heat in the water column, and that ice will not go all the way to the bottom, so now aquatic life can still exist. Imagine if ice sank, the ice would start down here and it just would keep filling and completely freeze this little guy in a block of ice, and no life could exist in the water. But because it floats, it just creates this thermal blanket and retains that heat in the water layer below. So that's a pretty cool feature of water. Okay, so that one's pretty short. That's all I have to say about that one. Okay, property number 4. Water is an excellent solvent. Sorry, this keeps popping up on my screen here. In fact, water is usually what's called the universal solvent. What do we mean by solvent? Well, in chemistry, a solution is made up of a solute plus a solvent. The solvent is the liquid part of that solution, and the solute is what's dissolved in the liquid. So for example, if you had salt water, the salt would be the solute and the solvent would be water. Saying that water is an excellent solvent is another way of saying that certain molecules dissolve really well in water. So many molecules dissolve well in water. It's primarily charged molecules. They have to be what we call polar molecules that dissolve well in water, and we'll talk about that a little bit more with one of the other properties of water. But water also doesn't really compete with the chemistry. So for example, if I add an acid to water, it becomes acid water. If I add sugar to water, it becomes sugar water. Water is not really competing with the chemistry that's happening. It's just an excellent medium in which a lot of this chemistry of life can occur. And because of that, we say that water is an excellent solvent. Relative to solutes, what is dissolved in the water, this will be talked about quite a bit when we talk about the cell and the chemistry of different things moving across cell membranes. I'm so sorry. My Apple Pencil just died, and when it died, my fingers started working on the screen again. But anyway, when we start talking about solutes moving across cell membranes, we're going to use an important term called molarity. This is the measurement of the concentration of a solute in a solution, and it's defined as the number of moles of solute per liter of solution. And we will talk about this more when we get to the cell, but I just kind of want to introduce this concept of molarity now so that when you hear this term later, you're going to know what we're talking about. So basically, a 10 molar sodium chloride solution would be 10 times as salty as a 1 molar sodium chloride solution. So this is just a measurement of the strength or the concentration of whatever's dissolved in that solution. And so molarity will be a term again that we use when we start talking about the cell. You don't need to worry about it a whole lot right now. Okay, the next property of water. This one is a little harder to explain, but this one is incredibly important in understanding cell membranes. So cell membranes are mostly made up of a molecule called a phospholipid. And those phospholipids have some unique chemical properties. And that is that they have this region of the molecule that we draw in this cartoon version as the head of the molecule that is actually what we call hydrophilic, and I'll define that in a second. And then these two tails that we call hydrophobic. So let me just take a second to define those two terms. So hydrophobic, hydro is water, and a phobia is a fear of something. So these are water fearing. In fact, they are repelled by water. They don't mix with water. And you can probably think of some types of molecules that are hydrophobic. You think about what doesn't mix with water, what kind of floats on the top of water. These would be fats, oils, fuels. You've probably all walked along a marina at some point and seen gasoline or oil floating on the surface near the boats. So those are the kinds of molecules that we would call hydrophobic or water fearing. Another term for hydrophobic is nonpolar. If something's nonpolar, it's also hydrophobic. Those really mean the same thing. So those are repelled by water. So on this phospholipid, those tails are hydrophobic, meaning they are repelled by water. They don't mix with water. They're afraid of water. Not really afraid, but that's just the term they're using. Okay, hydrophilic, on the other hand, philos means love. So these are water loving. In fact, they can mix with water. And they're what we call polar molecules. So polar and hydrophilic are synonymous. Hydrophobic and nonpolar are synonymous. Those are really saying the same thing. So those terms are used really interchangeably. Here's another picture of those phospholipids. You can see a little bit more detail. The reason those tails are hydrophobic is they're actually fats. They are fatty acid chains. And we'll learn a lot more about those when we talk about cell membranes. So the head region of this molecule, water loving. So in a cell, you have water outside the cell and inside the cell. And so those phospholipids would just be flipping back and forth, because as they contact the water, those tails are going to get turned opposite of the water. They're going to flip around. And what this causes is all the heads are going to be facing the water, and all of those tails are going to turn inward away from the water. And this causes what's called a bilayer of phospholipids. In fact, we call this a phospholipid bilayer. That means a double layer of phospholipids. And water forces this shape, this configuration. That's really significant because cell membranes are made primarily of a phospholipid bilayer. And that includes the plasma membrane that surrounds your cells. It includes all of the membrane membranous structures within your cells. And we'll learn a lot about those when we talk about the cell. Here's a quick picture of the cell membrane, and you can see all of these phospholipids. These are all the heads, and then these are all the tails facing inward, and you can see they formed a bilayer. It's a double layer of phospholipids that is formed here. So all of those orange heads going back around the whole surface of the cell, and all those little yellow tails are facing inward. So those tails, remember, those are all nonpolar tails. They are hydrophobic. Sorry, I'm getting all kinds of things popping up here. And then those heads are all interfacing with the water that's outside the cell and inside the cell. And those are all polar. Those are water loving. Okay, so water is forcing that shape. Going back to this original picture, if there's just water on the outside and not on the inside, those phospholipids are going to form a sphere, and that's called a mycele. This term right here, mycele, M-I-C-E-L-L-E. This is a sphere of phospholipids. And again, water is forcing that shape. So when water contacts those phospholipids, all those tails are going to flip inward, and they're immediately going to form this sphere. You experience this in the shower. When you use soap, soap is made of a phospholipid, and when the water contacts it, it forces it into the shape. Now, these aren't the bubbles. Okay, this is happening at the microscopic level. You can't really see this happening. But what's happening is as that mycele forms, it's trapping all these dirt particles. And so when you rinse away the soap, you're rinsing away the dirt, the oils that were on your skin. So that's how soap works. Okay, let's move to the next property of water. This is the last one, and this is a big one. This is the basis of acid-base chemistry, and this is saying that water dissociates into ions. Okay, so let's look at this word dissociate. Let's talk about the opposite of that first. Associate means come together. Dissociate is break apart or move apart. So in other words, water breaks apart into ions. And in particular, water breaks into a hydrogen ion, which ends up with a positive charge, and what's called a hydroxide ion, which has a negative charge. And if these two are equal in a solution, that's what we call a neutral solution. But if these aren't equal to each other, if one is greater than the other, this is what causes something to be an acid or a base. And you probably already know this has to do with pH. pH is how we measure the number of these ions in a solution. So we will talk about acid-base chemistry in this class quite a bit in talking about proteins, because all of the proteins in your body require the pH to be at a very specific level. And changes in pH within the body cause proteins to lose their shape, to change in shape. And then those proteins don't function correctly. So proteins function in a very narrow range of pH. So this pH scale is really important to understand in living organisms. So I'm going to write that statement here. Proteins function in a very narrow range of pH. And every protein has a normal range of pH in which it is functional. And it usually is whatever the normal pH is of that system. And the pH throughout your body changes, it's different. The pH in your liver is going to be different than the pH in your stomach, which is different than the pH in your small intestines, different than the pH of your blood. The key is that you need to keep pH constant for your proteins to function correctly. And in particular, enzymes are a type of protein that are required to carry out most of the chemical reactions in your body. And you need your enzymes working correctly in order to carry out the chemistry of life. So looking at this pH scale, neutral is what we call pH 7. And at neutral pH, the concentration of hydrogen ions in a solution is equal to the concentration of hydroxide ions in the solution. These little brackets mean concentration of. And if those two ions that water can break down into, if those are equal in a solution, it's what we call neutral pH. If the hydrogen ion concentration gets greater than the hydroxide ion concentration, we're going to shift this way on the pH scale, and that is what we call an acid. And this in particular is what makes something an acid, the concentration of hydrogen ions. So if that is greater than the concentration of hydroxide ions in a solution, then that solution is now an acid. To make something a base, we need the hydroxide ion to be greater. So a base is when the concentration of hydrogen ions is less than that of hydroxide ions. If you don't remember the greater or less than sign, remember that the mouth is always eating what's bigger. Okay, so in this case, the mouth was eating the bigger thing, and that was the hydrogen ions. Over here, the mouth is eating the hydroxide ions. This is what makes something a base. And in acid-base chemistry, anything with a pH below 7 down to 0 is an acid. And anything with a pH above 7 up to 14 is what we call a base. So acid this way and base this way. Something basic can also be called alkaline. You might see that term being used. Those terms are kind of used interchangeably. The key, though, is depending on what area of the body we're talking about, the pH is different. And that pH needs to stay constant for whatever normal is in that area of the body. And the way we keep that pH constant is using something called buffers. Buffers keep pH relatively constant. They resist changes in pH. Whatever is normal for that region of the body. Buffers do not keep pH neutral, okay, because there's pretty much no area of your body that is exactly 7.0. So neutral, to say something is neutral, pH is 7.0. And that's not what buffers are trying to do. Buffers are trying to keep it relatively constant, whatever is normal for that region of the body. So if it was in your stomach pH is pretty low. It can be as low as 1.0. So we're not trying to achieve neutral. We're trying to achieve whatever is normal for that region of the body. Your blood pH is about 7.35 to 7.45, and it really can't vary much outside that range, or those proteins are not going to function correctly. So buffers in the body are very, very important in keeping your pH constant. By the way, I know I've had students ask me in the past, hey, what about those alkaline waters that people say keeps their body from becoming too acidic? Let's think about that. So you drink an alkaline water, let's say it has pH 8, and you swallow that water. Where does that water go? What's the first stop after it goes down the esophagus? It goes right into your stomach and mixes with all that stomach acid. So unless you're putting it in your body with an IV, then it's really not doing anything. It's just mixing with the stomach acid. If you did take it in an IV, that would be pretty dangerous because your blood pH has to stay constant and you have buffers in the blood that are going to keep it constant. So no matter what you drink or eat, your body has a system to keep the pH normal. You don't need to drink some special water or eat something special to do that for you. Your body already has multiple systems set up to do that. The way these buffers work is an effective buffer system can shift either direction. So when the pH gets too high, so a rise in pH gets too high, what will happen is this weak acid will break apart and release the hydrogen ions. And remember, releasing hydrogen ions makes something an acid. So if the pH gets too high, all you have to do is add some acid to the system and it's going to bring the pH back down. When the pH gets too low, you tie that hydrogen up again and shift it back this direction because when it's this, it's not making it acidic. So it's only when those hydrogen ions are free in a solution, it's going to make it an acid. In other words, it decreases the pH. If you tie up the free hydrogen ions, you're going to increase the pH. And that's what we do when we shift it back this way. So an effective buffer system is going to be effective when the pH gets too high, it's going to go one direction. When the pH gets too low, it's going to go another direction. These bicarbonate ions are really important to understand, and I have a whole separate video involving a story of pH in the digestive system and how these bicarbonate ions play an important role. That's it for properties of water. Just to quickly review, I'm going to go back to this slide. This is the list of the properties of water that you need to understand for this class to understand water chemistry in living organisms. And again, there's a separate video on hydrogen bonding and a separate video on pH in the digestive system. Okay, thanks.